All right, everybody. In this video, can be a short video. I'm gonna do a little bit to set the stage for Descartes, help bridge the gap between Aristotle and Descartes. It helps to know the context in which someone's working. For Aristotle, the context was basically the same as Plato, at least late Plato. Aristotle and Plato knew each other. So when Plato was writing some of the stuff we read with Plato, Aristotle was like there as a young man. Right? So not a lot of difference there. But of course, Descartes lived around 2,000 years after Aristotle, and a lot happened. And the relationship between Aristotle and Descartes, or at least Aristotelian thought and Descartes, has a lot to do with what's happening in Descartes. So it's important to know. So here's a rough history of Europe for 2,000 years as it relates to the spread of ideas. You have Plato and Aristotle, and they're alive during the golden age of the city-states of Greece, really towards the end of the golden age of the city-states of Greece, especially Aristotle. Aristotle's alive. He manages to live long enough to see the Macedonians. The Macedonians are this kingdom of Greek speakers who live to the north of Greece, who don't live in city-states the way that like the people of Athens or Sparta or Thebes or Corinth, people like that do. But Macedonia nevertheless creates this incredibly powerful army under the reign of their king, Philip II. Philip II basically conquers all of Greece. His son, Alexander the Great, for whom Aristotle was a tutor, ends up conquering all the Persian Empire. This leads to, briefly, just a gargantuan Macedonian Empire, one of the largest land empires ever. Not the largest, not even actually close to the largest. I mean, it's close to the largest when you put it on a list, but like the Mongol Empire and the British Empire were just way, way, way bigger. But for the time, the Macedonian Empire that briefly existed was absolutely enormous. It stretched from Greece all the way to India. Alexander the Great ended up conquering lots of Indian kingdoms. It controlled lots of Central Asia, controlled all of modern-day Iran, Pakistan, really, Afghanistan, Iraq, Kuwait, modern-day Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, just a lot there. And these were some of the richest places on earth. Now, I said brief because after Alexander the Great dies, his empire breaks apart. Various generals take over little parts of it. And for a long time, these are the richest, most powerful places in the western part of the world, right? So there's this kind of divide where India is the bridge between the eastern power, basically China, and the western world. But then we get the rise of Rome. Rome starts conquering everybody. Eventually they conquer all these various Greek kingdoms. And even though it's Egypt, right? Egypt was ruled by Greece. Even though it's what we now think of as the Middle East was ruled by Greeks. Rome ends up conquering all of it. And the reason why this is important is when Alexander the Great conquered all these areas, he Hellenized them. He brought in a Greek ruling class. And that meant in order to be a part of the ruling class yourself, even if you were a Persian or Indian or Egyptian, you had to learn how to speak Greek, you read Greek, you became at least partially culturally Greek, which meant people like Plato and Aristotle, their books spread all over the place. Plato much more than Aristotle. Plato was right from the beginning, immediately incredibly popular and influential. And when I say popular, I just mean like very widely known and discussed. Aristotle wasn't quite as much. He was still well known. But clearly, Plato was the great light of Greek philosophy. Everyone pretty much agreed to that. When Rome comes along and they conquer all these Greek areas, they've conquered an area much richer than Italy and the Western conquest that Italy already had made. And also much more culturally advanced. It's kind of not entirely cool to say things like that anymore, more culturally advanced, but like the places where the Greeks were, the Mideast, Egypt, Greece itself, these were just more literate, they were wealthier, there was more infrastructure to support these kinds of things, the arts flourished there, right? And what the Romans basically did is they took Greek culture and adopted it to a very significant extent. You might know that like a lot of Roman gods are actually just Greek gods renamed. Similarly, the closest the Romans ever get to schools of philosophy or schools of thought really at all is just them taking Greek ideas and revising them slightly to fit sort of the Roman context, but really just bringing them over. But what this means is that Rome spreads Greek culture to all these places in Europe that previously hadn't been part of the civilized world from the perspective of Greeks. So you get Plato and Aristotle spreading into what we now think of as Italy, Spain, France, Portugal, England, North Africa, right? Other than Egypt, where Greek culture already was. So you get this spread, and everything's great, and everything's going fine, unless you're one of the people that Rome conquered, until eventually, in like the 400s AD, that period, the Western Roman Empire falls. And when it falls hard. And when it falls, basically all the cities of the Western Roman Empire, except for some of the cities in Italy, either cease to exist entirely or just become glorified towns. And this is what people know as the Dark Ages. Now, it's a little bit unfair to call them the Dark Ages. There was a lot of interesting stuff going on, and there were a lot of interesting achievements by the people at that time. But what was definitely true is that we don't have a lot of advancements in the areas of the arts, of philosophy, science, drama, literature, things like that. If you were to take even a really in-depth, really detailed history of philosophy course, you would be covering lots of people up to around the 400s to 500s AD, and then you're not going to cover really much of anyone for another 300 to 400 years. And then what happens is slowly, as Western Europe is rebuilding itself, Eastern Europe never had to rebuild itself. The Eastern Roman Empire never fell. They lost territory and stuff like that. And some of the people they lost territory to, like the Bulgars, didn't really support the kind of culture or intellectual activities that the Romans had. But still, there was a thriving intellectual life in the Eastern Roman Empire. And then after Islam arises in all the lands of the Caliphate. So you never really have a Dark Ages in that part of the world. Which is important because after Western Europe starts finding its way out of the Dark Ages, you start getting texts, books, from the eastern part of the old Roman Empire, migrating over. But this doesn't happen all at once. For whatever reason, there are some books that they have in the Middle Ages in Western Europe and some books that they don't. They get a copy of Plato's Timaeus, which is his dialogue on natural science, really early. They don't get the Meno, they don't get the Apology, they don't get the Republic or anything like that for a while. They don't get any Aristotle. And so there's about 200 to 300 years where Platonic thought is spreading all over the place throughout Western Europe, mainly through and under the auspices of the Catholic Church, which is really the only institution organized enough, wealthy enough to support institutions of higher learning. That's what all the European universities in the West, really all European universities grew out of, is schools maintained by the church. Around the 1200s, you start getting more and more works of Aristotle coming into Western Europe. This actually happens mainly through the interaction of Western Europeans with Muslims in Spain and in Italy. It actually doesn't come from the Eastern Roman Empire, where Aristotle's just not all that popular. And you get what's sometimes called the 12th or 13th century Renaissance. We have this term, the Renaissance, which we only ever really apply to like 1400s and 1500s in Italy, and then a little bit later in the rest of Western Europe. This is just clever branding by a bunch of people who were alive in Italy at the time. There were several episodes of the people in Western Europe sort of rediscovering ancient Greek and ancient Roman texts and making a lot of advances that way. But the reason why I bring this all up is starting around the 1200s, especially with a guy named Albert the Great and a guy named St. Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle comes in force to the Catholic university system. And what effectively happens is the Catholic Church adopts Aristotle as basically their approach to everything. There's actually a point where the Catholic Church says, if St. Thomas Aquinas said it, and it doesn't conflict with what the church has officially proclaimed, then just treat St. Thomas Aquinas as correct. But what St. Thomas Aquinas was doing was adapting Aristotle to Catholic theology. So what you're really getting is the Catholic Church saying, Aristotle's right about basically everything, unless it conflicts directly with the Bible or with the official interpretation of the Bible as advanced by the church, go with Aristotle. And so, fast forward to the 1500s and early 1600s, which is when Descartes is alive. you're getting Aristotle taught to all these people. If you went to a university in the early 1600s, as Descartes did, you were being taught Aristotle as basically the truth. And unfortunately, it's not Aristotle as the bold original thinker that he was. It's people just taking Aristotle's books and saying they're right about everything. So if you want to know the answer to the question, just check whichever book Aristotle wrote on it. People stopped to a significant extent, not entirely. Sometimes people like Descartes represent what's going on as like nobody was doing any innovative thought at all. That's not true. But what is true is that the dominant approach towards inquiry at all, any kind of theorizing, whether it be science or philosophy or theology, was just to check what Aristotle said instead of think for yourself, or instead of go check for yourself. So there's an example I like from Galileo. So Galileo relates a story. No telling whether this story is true, but he relates a story of a surgeon doing basically an autopsy, effectively, but as a dissection of an animal. For a long time, it was actually kind of forbidden to do any kind of dissection of a human body. This held back investigations into human anatomy for a very long time. But this guy was doing a dissection, a public dissection, to show people, like, here's what's going on inside the body of this animal. And he has a professor from one of the local universities there. And this professor is one of the people known for just sort of parroting what Aristotle said. Aristotle, who lived at a time when you weren't really allowed to dissect many bodies, human bodies definitely, but also when he just didn't have access, reliable access to all the kinds of animals that people would later. And the guy who's doing the dissection says, here, come, do you want to see where and I forget, some valve is? And the professor says, I don't need to go look. I remember where Aristotle says it is, so I know where it is. And the guy's just saying, no, just come look. Come look at the valve. I can show you it's not where Aristotle said it would be. The guy's like, nope, 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 nope. Galileo has a similar example of a professor who refuses to look through a telescope to see Jupiter's moons, which is one of Galileo's discoveries with his telescope, that Jupiter had moons. According to Aristotle's theory of astronomy, Jupiter shouldn't have moons. That everything that is outside of the orbit of the moon ought to orbit the Earth. It ought to move in circles around the Earth. And so something moving in circles around Jupiter totally threw that theory off. Galileo's analysis of this was that Aristotelians in his day, and Galileo and Descartes are close to contemporaries. Galileo's a little older, but they're alive at the same time and actually engage in some of the same things at the same time. Descartes ends up writing a book that argues for basically all the things that ended up getting Galileo in trouble with the church. But when he saw that Galileo was starting to get in trouble, Descartes just shelved it. He never published it because he was crafty enough to realize, I don't want to pick a fight with the church. But Galileo, his analysis of the problem was that there were a bunch of people who paid very close attention to what Aristotle's results were, and they ignored everything Aristotle said about method, about how you go about getting results. Galileo's opinion of Aristotle's method was that it was pretty good. He had quibbles. Galileo was in some ways closer to Plato than he was to Aristotle on questions of knowledge. But not all the way. He wasn't like a straight-up Platonist. But what Galileo thinks is, one thing Aristotle definitely got right is you have to base scientific claims off observations. And that's exactly what the Aristotelians of his day weren't doing. They were basing their scientific claims off Aristotle's books rather than following the same method that Aristotle said he's followed, which was to make lots and lots of observations and then to do induction. Right? And so you get this situation where the dominant academic and intellectual authorities are all clinging to Aristotle's results from 2,000 years before and ignoring all the discoveries being made. Because the 1500s and 1600s is basically, the story of science during that time is basically just the story of one by one various Aristotelian positions with regards to natural science falling. So with Copernicus and then later Galileo, you get Aristotle's theory of astronomy falling apart. You get Aristotle's theory of how the human heart works falling apart in the 1500s. The discovery that the heart was a pump a little bit later. So the first thing to fall was Aristotle thought there had to be a perforated valve in the human heart to allow air to move through the heart, and or air to move from the lungs into the heart. And that turned out not to be right. There was no such valve. And then when you get Harvey discovering that the heart is a pump, well, that just throws everything off, because Aristotle did not think the heart pumped blood. That's not what he thought it did. Or at least he didn't think that's what it was really for. He thought the heart was there to, well, I'm not getting into that. There's too much detail already about Aristotle's anatomical views. But Aristotle on physics came under assault, mainly from Galileo. Aristotle on astronomy came under assault from Copernicus and Galileo, and then lots of other people like Kepler and eventually Newton. Aristotle on medicine came under the assault of lots of people. Aristotle on lots of just biological and chemical claims came under assault. Sometimes people overdid it, so sometimes people got so into trying to debunk Aristotle that they went after things that Aristotle was actually right about. So Aristotle was, for example, correct in this debate that had been going on for a long time about human embryology, which is that Aristotle said the human embryo develops out of a non-organized mass of fluid into an embryo. And as opposed to Aristotle, there were these people who were saying, no, the way embryology works is inside an embryo, there's a tiny, fully formed person, and all that's happening with the development of the embryo is the tiny person is eating and getting bigger. And for like 100, 200 years, there were people who were like, no, we know that this is true. They actually thought they could see a tiny, full-formed human being in an early stage embryo by looking in a telescope, or a microscope, rather. So sometimes they went too far, but a lot of Aristotle's results, his results in the sciences, were falling from people using a method that Aristotle himself would have liked, making observations, right? Trying to figure out how to make sense of those observations. And so the beginning of Descartes' book is all about, he doesn't mention Aristotle in it, but what he's basically talking about when he talks about the fact that he's become aware that many of the things he used to believe were wrong, is that he's become aware that many of the things he was taught at university were wrong, because he was taught that Aristotle was basically right about everything. And he's living through the time, the early stages of the scientific revolution, where Aristotle's scientific views were coming under sustained assault and refutation. So that's the context in which Descartes writes his book. That's the impetus for it, trying to figure out how to make sense of knowledge in a time where every major theory that's being taught at university is being shown to be wrong. Another thing to know about Descartes, one of the reasons that he's famous is in his work as a mathematician. So Descartes' claim to fame in mathematics, and he's actually got a lot of things. He worked on a lot of things, he advanced a lot of things in mathematics, but probably the thing you're most familiar with, and probably the thing that had the most lasting influence, is Galileo came up with coordinate geometry. So you might remember from geometry, you get your x and your y axis. I don't know why one of them is much longer than the other, who knows? And you would very quickly do this. You would come up with points. So you have, 1, 1 making 1, 1. And here's, 1, 2. And so on. The idea is you can break space up into a bunch of coordinates. And then what that allows you to do is it allows you to turn geometry into basically algebra. So you might remember learning the slope formula and learning formula to describe various shapes. Becomes very useful once you do three-dimensional geometry to have coordinate geometry. By allowing every part of every shape to be assigned a number, or a pair of numbers rather, you could turn a lot of geometry questions that had previously been qualitative into quantitative. Basically turn them into algebra problems. This is a huge development, so much so that nowadays it might seem weird to you that once upon a time people did geometry without coordinate geometry, but you go back before Descartes and you're dealing with people like Euclid back in like the 200s, 300s AD. Euclid did geometry by just thinking it through without coordinate geometry, without coordinates. There were no formula. So that's a big deal. Another big deal about Descartes is he did a lot of work in physics. Now, we don't remember this work in physics because Descartes has the sort of the status as the person Newton replaced. Descartes' theories about physics were very interesting on their own. They're they're the early stages of a debate that would carry on all the way through Einstein about the issue of whether there can be action at a distance. So you might remember from learning about Newton that Newton said gravitational force is force acting on an object from another object, and it's reciprocal. The objects are acting on each other. But this force seems to act at a distance, right? So the sun is acting on us right now immediately. It's not sending stuff out to do stuff to us. It's pulling us right now at a distance. Newton said this, and people like Descartes, although Descartes was before Newton, important to remember, they didn't buy that. They thought there had to be some mechanism that explained gravity, which everyone was aware of. People say these silly things like Newton discovered gravity. Everybody knew about gravity. What Newton did was he developed a formula that described how gravity worked. And he did so building on the work of previous scientists. Nobody discovered gravity. People have known about gravity for as long as people have known about falling down. But Descartes thought gravity had to work through some mechanism that involved things touching each other. So he thought space had to be a fluid that swirled, and what kept the Earth moving around the sun was that the sun somehow created a vortex in space that caused space to flow, and that Earth was caught in that flow. So instead of action at a distance, you have the sun acting on a fluid, acting on the Earth, right? Now, in the end, this didn't work out, and Newton's the one who showed how it didn't work out. A lot of what Newton did was targeted at Descartes, although Descartes himself doesn't come up in a lot of Newton's work, because who Newton is targeting are people who are following Descartes, who take Descartes' physics as a jumping off point. Gottfried Leibniz, who would come much later, would end up supporting Descartes. He would prefer Descartes' position. He didn't like action at a distance. And that attitude carries through in continental physics all the way through to Einstein, who called it spooky action at a distance. And one of the things the theory of general relativity does is it basically gets rid of action at a distance when it comes to gravity. So there is lots of interesting stuff about Descartes. The thing to realize about Descartes is he's an active scientist. He's an active mathematician. At the same time, he's doing this philosophical work. The philosophical work is only one part of what he's doing. He's like Plato and Aristotle that way. More like Aristotle, though. Aristotle's an active scientist with active scientific research projects, mostly in biology, but still, he did work in physics. The reason I bring this up is part of the point for Descartes of doing the philosophical work that's presented in the Meditations on First Philosophy is meant to support scientific theorizing, meant to make sense of how we can know the things that we think we discover when we do science. That's the purpose of this book, and that helps you to understand what he's doing and why he's doing it. Now, I promised this would be shorter than most videos. That turned out to be a lie. Whoops.